Alright, so let us begin with an introduction into the first work in which we are going to be reading excerpts from, which is, of course, the Aeneid of Publius Vergilius Maro, whom we, of course, call Virgil. Born in 70 BC and dying in 19 BC, his life essentially spanned the most chaotic and the most, as I often say in Latin 1 and 2, higgledy and piggliness period of all of Roman history, at the fall of the Roman res publica and the establishment of the Principate by Augustus, bringing an end to the civil wars and obviously what the Romans have craved for so long, which is the Pax Romana. Essentially half of his life was spent in that turbulent time and half of it spent in the establishment of peace by Augustus, and the work that is the Aeneid reflects much of his own experience in the wider Roman world. Now, if you were to be asked by someone to encapsulate what it means to be a Roman, to encapsulate the heart of Romanitas, all that you would have to do is to hand to them the Aeneid. There is no equivalent work that I can think of in any civilization in history which by its civilization is so revered as the end-all be-all work. Let's say in Western civilization for us, there are two entities that have come to dominate more than any other as the English-speaking Western world. And that, of course, is the Bible, particularly the King James Bible, that has obviously come to be so influential in the last 400 years, and obviously before that, even before the translation of the King James Version. And then, of course, you have the God of English, Shakespeare. Virgil is Bible and Shakespeare in one for the Romans. The influence and the absolute large shadow that is cast upon the entirety of the Roman world cannot be overstated. The moment that the Aeneid burst upon the scene, post-19 BC, for Virgil, on his deathbed, requested that it be burned, we know not why. Of course it was not. Brought to Augustus, or at this time, yes, Augustus, he had already changed into that name, previously 8 years before Virgil's death, establishing himself not as emperor, but as princeps, but for all intents and purposes, as we look back upon it, he essentially had become Rome's first emperor. He had been the person to commission this work, this great epic, to rival the epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Greek culture that laid claim to them, and Homer, obviously. Augustus wanted his own national epic, his own work that would embody Rome, that would embody what he has done for Rome. And so Virgil is going to write this work, and it would come to rival it. For the moment that it hits Roman society, it truly becomes, like I said, their Shakespeare, their Bible, all in one. And as such, it becomes the singular work that is taught in schools. From Virgil's Aeneid, they thought that school children could gain all that they would need as far as being a Roman and a Roman citizen. Now, the Aeneid in and of itself is written in 12 books. And those 12 books can be divided into the first 6, 1 through 6, and the second 6, 7 through 12. And as Virgil is composing this work, and when he was first approached by Augustus, he was not even the first choice. The first choice that Augustus approached was, of course, the poet Horace. But Horace is a lyric poet, and said that he was not up to the task of writing this monumental, epic poem that would come to embody an entire civilization. Virgil had to choose as to what would be the epic hero. For when you look at the Iliad of Homer, sung 700 plus years previous of Virgil, if you look at the Iliad, it's quite clear as to who the hero is. It's Achilles. The very first line, sing the wrath of Achilles. Although I would argue that the true hero of the Iliad would be Hector, but nevertheless. In the Odyssey, there can be no doubt. In the name itself of the work, you have Odysseus' name. And so to have this epic, in the epic tradition that he will be writing, this poem that of course involves great heroic deeds and great wars and great accomplishments, we don't call a rom-com an epic movie. Epic because of the sweeping narrative and the great deeds that are done by heroes. And then obviously the ancient tradition, gods alike. And so in deciding upon whom or what, and what is the parameters by which you are going to have this epic that he is writing at the behest of Augustus, it'd be like us trying to write an American epic. Who or what is going to be the great epic hero? And what is going to be the setting and the situation? We have things to choose from. It could be George Washington, the Revolution, Abraham Lincoln, the great calamity that was the Civil War. It could be obviously FDR leading not only the United States but the Allies, along with others, to victory over the great Nazi threat. It could be the Civil Rights Movement that still continues on to this day with perhaps the great heroic hero of MLK. But we have lots of things to choose from, and Virgil was no different. And so, instead of choosing Romulus, cannot have that. He was a king, Rex, the most hated word in the Latin language. He settled upon an obscure myth. A myth of a Trojan hero named Aeneas, escaping the great Holocaust that was the destruction of Troy at the hands of the Greek, due to treachery and the Trojan horse. And his great quest, not only to wander the Mediterranean, much in the same way that Odysseus had to wander the Mediterranean from the Trojan War, just like Aeneas, but Odysseus going to his home, Aeneas to establish a new home. And when he finally arrives to a place he doesn't even originally know where he is going, Hesperia in Italy, fights a great calamitous war, much like the War of Troy in its 10th year as told by the Iliad. And so in the very structure of the Aeneid in and of itself, you can see Virgil hearkening back to Homer with the Odyssey and the Iliad in its structure. Now you know the story, as it were. He leaves Troy. He is on his way. He is thwarted at every turn, of course, by the goddess Juno, who does not want him to establish the Roman race. And let's be clear about that. Virgil has Aeneas not establish Rome. Aeneas is going to be establishing the Roman race that then hundreds of years hence would establish Rome, April 21st, 753 BC. And Juno wants to prevent this at every turn. And as such, she is trying to prevent Aeneas not only from being successful, but even at times trying to kill him. And that's where we will begin in Book 1. For the Aeneid is going to begin in medias res. Literally, as told to us from Horace, in the middle things. Like my favorite example of a movie, which begins in medias res, would be the movie Cars. Because it's literally in the middle of a race. And so in that way, you are in the midst of the action, thrust within it, long from Troy, and you get the backstory in books 2 and 3, as told in flashback by Aeneas at a banquet. But when we first encounter him, he is off the coast of Sicily. Having already made his way there from Troy, he is setting sail, and we will read how Juno, wanting to stop him, will create, well, she won't, but she will approach the god of the winds to create a horrific storm, crashing out as many of Aeneas's 20 ships, and therefore he lands on the shores of Carthage. That is what happens in Book 1. He is invited in Book 2 to a banquet held by the Queen of Carthage, the brand new Queen of Carthage, a brand new city, where at a banquet he will tell of the travels and the horrors of the fall of Troy, and the travels afterwards to get him to that point. That is books 2 and 3. Books 4 is then going to be back in real time, in which a love affair blossoms between Aeneas and Dido, resulting obviously in the tragedy of Aeneas being compelled to leave, dumping poor Dido, who had felt as though the relationship she had entered into was an actual marriage, leading to her tragic suicide. Book 5, they stop back off at Sicily and they host funeral games for Aeneas' father, Anchises, who had died even before the storm on the island of Sicily. And then Book 6, in which Aeneas visits the underworld to see, as told by his father, who is in the underworld, the great glory that Rome will be one day. And those are the books that we'll be reading. Books 1, excerpts from. Books 2, Books 4, and Book 6. Unfortunately, in Latin, we read nothing, Books 7 through 12. But we all know the story there, briefly, that once he arrives in Italy, he is going to meet the king Latinus and the queen Amata. An agreement is made that their daughter Lavinia will obviously marry Aeneas, joining together the Latin race and the Trojan race to create a new race via that union. But Juno, still wanting to stop Aeneas, already having thwarted her attempts to stop him in the storm and landing at Carthage, is going to enrage the queen Amata and all of the previous, that suitor Turnus, who had previously been arranged to marry Lavinia, and all of his followers are enraged and erupted and inflamed in a new great war that finally culminates in its end in the final book, in which Aeneas faces off against Turnus, ending with, of course, the death of Turnus itself. But we shall begin reading in Book 1, in which, in the classic way of an epic, you will invoke the muse, and the very first words and the first lines will tell us the focus total of the epic as a whole, and it will reflect both the Odyssey aspect of the Aeneid and the Iliad aspect of the Aeneid. But I expect you to read the introduction of our textbook, which you have available to you digitally until we have a textbook distribution, to reaffirm all of these details and items in greater detail than just this brief video that I have made here. We went over the Aeneid story, of course, journeys of Aeneas, the founder of the Latin race, not Rome, in Latin 1, but it's probably a bit foggy in your brain, so you need to obviously become more familiar again. So, we shall begin, and I'll make now my first video going over those first few lines.